and the season premiere of Dark Side of the Ring did 272,000, a .09. It was the third biggest show in the history of Vice TV, trailing the prior Dark Side of the Ring episodes on Owen Hart, which was #1, and Chris Benoit, which was the season 2 premiere. So, third highest in both the network and the show's history. And I wrote a pretty lengthy review on the Brian Pillman documentary. Did you get to see it? And what were some of your overall reactions to some of the people interviewed and the overall story?
I did get to see it. I thought it was fantastic. And first of all, like, I don't know if this was the case last time they did this, but like, you can catch this right on Crave, like the day
immediately after. Yeah, that's how I saw it.
It was so easy. I have it set up on my Roku and I just like click there and it's already right there. So if you're in Canada, check it out on Crave.
Was it right? Was it right when the show started, or did they upload it right after?
That I don't know. I checked it in the morning.
So okay, because I watched it late too. Okay.
I thought this was so good. It was like such a well done. Like, it's hard for me to say in comparison to the other Dark Side of the Rings, like how much I like this one more. But I definitely rank it right up there. You and I had just not long ago talked about the Loose Cannon documentary that WWE originally did, and obviously something like this goes into far more depth, with a far more kind of honest and raw look at not just, Brian Pillman's tragedies, but the tragedy and the fallout surrounding his death and the impact of his death on his entire family. And goes a lot deeper into like
just brutal details. Brutal. Oh. Like your heart breaks for these children and what they went through and the ages that they were going through this. It was just like Brian Pillman Jr. was 4 when his father died. And man, that scene where they had the reenactment where they're describing the kids like not comprehending the funeral and then saying bye to their dad. I mean, that was just a gut punch to hear.
I was so incredibly impressed with the amount of people that they were able to speak to for this documentary. Obviously Kim Wood, who had a role, I believe, in the Loose Cannon documentary, but certainly not like this. Okay.
This guy will be a meme forever. I mean, this guy would be, I remember when we years and years ago it was maybe like, I think it was like 9 years it coincided since Pillman's passing. So we did like a Brian Pillman episode on the law. And 2 of the guests we got were Kim Wood, who I was able to find, and Mark Madden. So that was like it was right when the Pillman DVD was coming out. But so I've had the chance to speak to Kim Wood years and years ago, but the memorable lines were certainly reserved for Kim Wood. This guy was a character, but also like had an innate knowledge of Brian Pillman. He was a father figure to this individual.
The way he was positioned in this doc, I mean, as not just like, if you watch Loose Cannon, you kind of get the sense, okay, he's the guy who was a bit of a mentor during his like football days and then like hooked him up with the Hart family. But beyond that, you don't really get that much of a sense of his influence on his career. In this, I mean, he essentially kind of played as Yoda, or like his, the guy behind, his master strategist. He was his like Paul Heyman behind the scenes as he was like, negotiating behind both companies. But some of the lines that he had in this, it's money. It's the bottom fucking line. Didn't matter where he ended up. Calling like, what did he say about Vince?
Oh, I don't even know if I should repeat it.
We shouldn't repeat it. He basically called Vince a whore, which definitely
he described
was not something that made the Loose Cannon documentary, if that was a part of that one. He was so fascinating. But man, like
I thought there were a lot, like, obviously, like, the wrestling is the backdrop. The wrestling is the connective tissue of all these episodes, but I find it's like the family stuff to me that is what's going to be so compelling and draw you in. It's a heartbreaking story with what the children had to go through, and Brian Pillman being very descriptive of the abuse he suffered from his stepfather. And it's a miracle these children came out as they have, and I think in large portion because they had this saint of an aunt in Linda Pillman, who's interviewed, and honestly, it's like there's so much heaviness in this documentary that when that scene occurred where you hear Brian scream about the spider upstairs, it was like the biggest, like, you just got to exhale for a minute because this is so heavy. I love that scene. It was just like a welcome, just moment of levity in a documentary it's very emotional. It's a very tough watch. I was very surprised that Melanie Pillman ended up doing this, but
man. Yeah,
she is. Yeah, I mean, you listen visually. You can see the toll this woman's life has had on her when you're seeing the shots of her from '97 to present day. If there's a silver lining, it's the fact that there is the attempt at a reconciliation between at least her and Brian that we see at the end of the documentary. Because Melanie was someone, she did not participate with Liam O'Rourke's book, and she does not come off well in that. I would say she doesn't come off great in this documentary, but she also is very aware of the fact of all the pain she caused and what her lifestyle did. And maybe it will not be forgiven, but you have at least Brian Pillman Jr. explaining that, he is going to try because it's her mother. And it's just a captivating story. This could be its own series.
Oh, it could be a movie. It could be, yeah, absolutely. But Melanie's inclusion in this documentary, along with the children, really as the relationship between the other kids, and Melanie started to reveal itself throughout the documentary, it became really unique because I think going into this, you assume that maybe these are people that suffered a loss together as a family, and you would assume that they were still cool. But as the documentary progresses and you realize how much anger and resentment the two first children hold towards Melanie, and Melanie herself admitting fault and regret for a lot of the decisions she's made in her life, it became that such a unique experience because you almost got the sense that you were playing a bit of a mediator as both sides were kind of giving their own stories. And very clearly there's still a lot of anger and resentment from the side of the children. I do wonder if after watching this there's any follow-up, and maybe that's something we'll get an update on about the relationship. But the Dark Side of the Ring series has been pretty strong in actually facilitating some
reconciliation.
Form of change. Yeah, reconciliation and actual change in many of the subjects that they talk with and feature. And man, there's a lot to work out between several people here, but we hope that maybe, I don't know, there's movement towards some sort of positive direction for everybody's lives. But listen, look at the conversation we're having right now. This covers this topic in a level of depth that we don't often see in wrestling documentaries. Certainly not in any of the A&E documentaries or WWE productions. So man, they started off season 3 with just a great piece of work.
Yeah, I mean, on the wrestling side, I thought Jim Ross was unbelievable in this. You have to remember, when this guy is sitting down for a lot of these subjects, he's reliving some of the worst days of his career and probably life, having to relive. He was the bridge that brought Brian into WCW. So it's he had a relationship with this guy going back to the late 80s. And then he finds himself in the position where he has to be the bad cop in WWF and has to, for Brian's own good, administer this drug test that, Brian just completely flips on Jim Ross. And to hear Jim Ross that at the end of this, just have the conclusion, I failed with Brian. That was a really, man, that was a big statement from Jim Ross. And you can just really tell the disdain that Jim Ross and Jim Cornette had for that treatment of Melanie the night after his death, which every time I see, it's just the worst taste in my mouth watching this. And Melanie kind of downplays it of she doesn't even barely remember it, but she does state the fact, and this was new information, that she had requested to Vince McMahon not to bring up any drug related discussion because there's no results on an autopsy report. She doesn't know the answers. And if that was accurate, I mean, Vince McMahon completely ignored that request, and that makes it even worse. A segment that I already detested. That was even worse to hear. He comes off very, very cold and callous in this for his treatment of that.
So, JR, like we've seen in many of the previous documentaries, kind of has to play, like, by default, the WWE voice. He kind of has to play the justification of, many of the company's ideas at the time because he held that high position as talent relations there. We didn't have a Bruce Pritchard on this one. We obviously don't have a Vince McMahon. And as a result, like, much of the blame, we don't get his answer. So it will never get Vince on this documentary series, but I would say as far as like names that they didn't manage to get, because we got almost everybody, but obviously Vince, maybe Brett, like, but Brett wasn't necessarily integral to like much
Bruce
beyond.
Hart. Bruce Hart was very tight with Pillman, but I do think like sometimes you can think of like really great interview subjects and. Like we always talk about with Darkseid, it's like they're in a race against time to tell some complex stories in a limited time. And then you have to balance them. Like, yes, Bruce Hart had a very close relationship with Brian and integral in that loose cannon character. But when you have Kim Wood and you have Bruce Hart, how much overlap is there? And you have to make that decision in documentary filmmaking. So sometimes there can be great ideas for guests, but if we have someone that covers a lot of that same ground, you do have to make those decisions.
And we're also talking about filming this in the midst of a pandemic, which makes this all the more impressive. But, in terms of like production, I thought the reenactments were incredibly strong and very tasteful. And I wanted to give a shout out to even the score, the music in this thing was tremendous. It is done by a gentleman by the name of Andrew McPherson, who, just like there's a style and like, man, just kind of taste to like these shows that just are fantastic. So I can't really say enough good things in my recommendation.
Yeah, I think like the best compliment you can give is that Dark Side of the Ring, I think, especially if they've gotten deeper into their productions, is being able to take some very sensitive topics and it never feels exploitive or like it. Like I said this in my review, it felt like this was therapy for the Pillman family to be able to have this to have this forum to get a lot of this stuff out. And I think that's a real credit because this is it's a very difficult story to tell and one that I think they were very careful to navigate and did it in a very classy way.
Totally. And this is absolutely not like the intent I'm suggesting of this, but Brian Pillman Jr. comes across like so incredibly grounded and mature coming out of this terrible tragedy that like you really anybody who watches this like can't help but want to see this man succeed in his career. And man, like you just kind of your heart breaks for him, but you also admire his strength and ability to like forgive his mother, and like you want to patch things up on that end, and just like he just comes across so likable. So yeah.
So that's the Dark Side of the Ring episode. I'd also recommend, if you haven't read it, the Crazy Like a Fox book that Liam O'Rourke wrote. It is just a fantastic book on Brian Pillman's life and career. So that is worth checking out. And we did do a recent Rewind Away looking back at that Loose Cannon DVD that the WWE put out in 2006, which becomes really our look at Brian Pillman from a couple of months back.
You interviewed Liam O'Rourke too, didn't you?
We did a Q&A on the site with him. I did not do the interview, but there is an interview up in the archives right when the book came out, if you want to check that out. Let's move on to SmackDown from Friday night.